Hey viewers, my name's Cara. Today I want to talk about the book that I finished reading most recently, which is the new Pagan Portals Reclaiming Witchcraft by Irisanya Moon. I mentioned in my recent video about planning out my reading for the rest of the year that I actually got this book a little earlier in the summer directly from Irisanya, and I made myself wait to read most of it. I did read the introduction right away because I couldn't wait that long. But I'm reading a lot of stuff right now, and so I wanted to try to finish a couple of things before I really started into this, even though it is very short. So I knew it would go rather quickly. So I read the introduction months ago, but then after I finished a couple of other books I was reading, I dove into this one. And this is actually my first Pagan Portals read ever. I hadn't actually heard of Pagan Portals until a few years ago, handful of years ago, something like that, when I believe it was Danny from Esoteric Moment, who also used to be on the Pagan Perspective collab channel with me, who first mentioned Pagan Portals books in one of her videos or in a post or something, and that was my introduction to the fact that they even existed. So I only heard about them several years ago, but this is actually the first one I've ever read. So I do know from looking at a lot of them, it seems like a lot of them are quite short as well. Some of them I've seen are a little bit thicker, but for the most part it seems like they're all just meant to be kind of a little taste of whatever the subject matter is. And there are some that are devoted to teaching you about specific deities or specific paths or specific practices. So this one is about the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. The biggest thing maybe that's difficult with something like this as the name of a tradition, when you're using hashtags and things on the internet, the word reclaiming, of course, is also just a word. People reclaim practices and words and terms and names, such as choosing to identify as witches. And that is, I believe, where the name reclaiming for the tradition of witchcraft that this is came from, is that one of the things is that we specifically identify as witches and reclaiming that word. Other people also talk about how they are reclaiming witchcraft and reclaiming certain practices in their own paths and practices, even if they are not necessarily affiliated in any way with the tradition by the same name. So if you follow me on Instagram or anything like that and you've seen me post about it, I tend to try to specify that I'm talking about the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft, or I will capitalize capital R, capital W, reclaiming witchcraft, or reclaiming tradition, or whatever. That is to hopefully prevent confusion between this and other people who are talking about the process of reclaiming something about witchcraft for their personal path or practice. So that's kind of the first thing I want to note, is that this is about a tradition that is called reclaiming. It is a tradition that sort of grew out of groups in the 1970s and the 1980s in California in the United States. And over the decades since then, it has grown into a global tradition. It did not start out with the people who sort of got it going thinking that it would develop into its own tradition, but it has. And that's what Irisanya is talking about in this book. It starts out with a little bit of the history, kind of what I just said, but going a little bit more in depth about how it went from being a group of people practicing witchcraft together to teaching classes and coming up with sort of a structure of things that would be shared with other people, and then as that spread to more communities, becoming a global tradition. And Irisanya was actually one of my first reclaiming teachers at the one and only witch camp that I have attended so far. Irisanya and Erie were my two elements teachers. So I do know Irisanya personally, have worked with them in person, and I was really excited to read this. This is also my first time reading any of Irisanya's published work. Well, not true actually, because Irisanya also contributed to the Elements of Magic book that was edited by G'day Parma and Jane Meredith, and I did a video about that last year when I read it as well. So not my first time reading something of Irisanya's that has been published, but first time reading something that is just written by them. So what do I want to tell you about this book other than it is very quick? It's less than 100 pages overall, so it's definitely something that even if you're reading 10 other books right now, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to get through. It's just a quick sort of introduction to a lot of things, a lot of concepts about the reclaiming tradition. This is not a how to practice witchcraft book. It is not a how to practice witchcraft like a reclaiming tradition based witch book. It's not that either. It is a book about reclaiming as a tradition and the history, how it became a tradition, the structure of how the tradition actually operates. There's a little bit of like what the basic structure of a reclaiming ritual might look like. And so there's a little bit of like giving you sort of an idea of what you can expect if you ever attend a reclaiming ritual or a witch camp or anything like that, which that's another thing I've noticed on social media is that other people, other groups have started using the term witch camp for when they maybe do an online course and they're considering it like a witch boot camp. Some people call it witch camp, but when we're talking about reclaiming witch camps, that is a different thing and is a very specific thing. They are intensive trainings within the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. So that's another note that might be a little bit of confusion. But yeah, this is about sort of the structure of how the tradition works. It talks about the reclaiming principles of unity, which is the document, kind of a statement of what makes a reclaiming witch, and one of basically the only things that is required for me, for anyone, to identify as part of this tradition or this community is that we identify as witches and we agree with the principles of unity, or we agree to operate under the principles of unity when we are in reclaiming community. It is not a tradition that requires that you only be reclaiming. So a lot of people, you could be a reclaiming witch and also some other type of witch, or you could be an initiate of another type of witchcraft tradition, or you could be something completely different. You could be part of a druid organization as well as a reclaiming witch. So it's not something that is like you have to only do this all the time. But when it comes to the principles of unity, it would be like when we are operating in community, when you're at a reclaiming led class or camp or something like that, we operate under those principles. And the chapter about that, about the POU, the principles of unity, in this book, Irisanya talks about the fact that this was a document that was originally agreed upon by representatives of the entire community in the late 90s, and it was updated once already in 2012. Now, this book came out a little bit earlier in 2020, this year, so it does not include the fact that right now, in September of 2020, there is another Birch Council meeting, Birch Council being one of the things that Irisanya explains a little bit about here, part of the structure of the reclaiming tradition and global community. This month, Birch Council meetings and discussions are going on concerning more suggestions that have been made for changing and updating other areas, or an other area, one specific paragraph of the principles of unity. So Irisanya in this book talks about how it is a living tradition. We are a community that works by consensus decisions, and so every so often there are big discussions that have to do with things that would affect the entire community, such as, do we need to change or update something that is in the principles of unity to better reflect the way that the community is growing, changing, evolving, becoming more inclusive, learning from mistakes that we have made and seeking to do better in the future, and how that can always change as we change. And in fact, that is happening presently. We are discussing further changes and in another meeting next calendar year, some decisions will be made about how the principles of unity might further be being updated. So that's a really cool thing, and that's talked about here. Irisanya lists in a short section entitled "The Threads That Brought Us Here" the main sort of movements throughout time that kind of came together to create what became the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft, and those sort of threads and influences are listed as return to the goddess spirituality, feminism as a political movement, fairy witchcraft, F-E-R-I, the fairy tradition of witchcraft as taught by Victor and Cora Anderson, and activism and politics. Those are listed as the four sort of core influences that came together that helped shape reclaiming into the tradition that it became, and those are sort of the four things that got the ball rolling, so to speak. And then, yeah, I think sort of the biggest thing about this book is that, like I said, it talks about the actual structures of reclaiming and how the tradition works. So it talks about how we are a registered nonprofit, and so that means that somewhere in reclaiming that there has to be a board of directors. And how do we go about doing that in a community that is non-hierarchical and works by consensus and doesn't really have any set leaders, but rather everyone is empowered to be a leader, and everyone does lead at different points in time and at different moments, and people choose different things that they want to do or leadership roles that they want to step into. So it talks about that, like, how does that work, and how do we bring representatives from all of our different communities together at different points throughout the year, usually in person, although in 2020 a lot of things have been online for obvious reasons, but also, you know, exploring, can we do that more often, because it is a global tradition, and so bringing people together to make representative decisions for the entire community often means that people have to travel across the world, and not everyone can do that. So I think this year, something that I've seen a lot of people talking about is how we're exploring how useful online meetings can be for allowing more people to be represented in these decisions. And so, like, for me personally, this is the first time that I'm having an opportunity to be a bigger part of witnessing and learning about how some of these tradition-wide decisions are being made with things like Birch Council meetings and stuff like that, and that's talked about in this book. So that's something that, you know, a lot of people, when we talk about, like, what tradition of witchcraft do you practice, or what is your path in witchcraft or neo-paganism, usually we're talking about things like, do you cast a circle or not? Do you work with the elements or not? And Irisanya talks a bit about that kind of basic stuff in here too, just to give you a little idea of, like, where we're coming from. But not a lot of people ask, like, how do you organize your tradition-wide decision-making process? And how do you decide who gets to be on a representative council? And how do you find out what happens in those meetings? And, you know, what is the process for conflict resolution? Not a lot of people ask that about most neo-pagan groups or traditions, and that's what this book is about, is talking about how reclaiming does that stuff. Like I said, it talks about, like, what you might expect at a ritual, but this book doesn't have, like, a script for how to do a ritual like a reclaiming witch, like we see in a lot of other sort of beginner witchcraft books. So that's not what this book is. This book is really, like, if you're interested in the reclaiming tradition, either for yourself or because you know someone who is affiliated with the tradition and you're just kind of wondering, what the heck is that tradition? What are they about? How do they work? You just want to read a little bit about another tradition. That's kind of what this book is. It talks about our core classes and a little bit about how those came to be, but also a description of what they're like and sort of the role that they play in the tradition, I guess you could say. But this is also a jumping off point as well, because there is a recommended, well, it's a resources list in the back where other books are mentioned that actually dive even deeper into all of those concepts that are covered by, well, I say all, but most of the core classes. So I mentioned Elements of Magic and the fact that there is an Elements of Magic book now. Elements of Magic is the first sort of foundational core class of Reclaiming Tradition. Irisanya gives a little synopsis of it here and what we teach and what we learn about under each of the elements: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit or center. And then there's an Elements of Magic book that allows you to see more than 30 different reclaiming teachers and writers and contributors take on something about the Elements of Magic class. So there is a book version of that, and as I mentioned, I did a video about that last year when I read it. There's also another one of the classes is called Iron Pentacle, and there are multiple Iron Pentacle books, one of which was also done by G'day Parma and Jane Meredith, who did the Elements of Magic book. I also recently heard from one of my reclaiming community friends that there is at least one other Iron Pentacle book. I don't remember the author of that other one because I haven't seen or read it personally myself, but I just learned that there are multiple, and so to my knowledge, there are not books that are specifically about the other core classes, but the classes themselves are sort of briefly talked about in here, and I have taken 3 out of 5 of them now. When I went to Witch Camp, I wasn't actually aware that the 5th one had been sort of consensus upon and agreed upon in 2012 at that big meeting when the Principles of Unity was last updated as well. So when I went to Witch Camp, people were talking about the 4 core classes, and I was like, all right, well, I'm going to take all of those because I want to student teach, and I want to be able to become a teacher. I want to build community in my area, which I can do without being a full teacher, but it's a little bit easier if I have the teaching background as well. And so I set out to take those first 4 classes, and I have now taken 3 out of 4 of those, and then the 5th one I learned about a little later on, and it's actually about communities. It's actually about building communities, so it would be perfect because that's one of the things that I want to do. But since it is a newer class, it has not been offered as widely, as frequently, or in as many places yet. There are also ways that people offer these classes online, so I can keep an eye out for that. If anyone's ever offering it online, that might be something I want to do, because in my state where I live, there is not an active reclaiming community. I am helping to build it and develop it. And so that's talked about in here: community development and the importance of community and community gatherings that, when it's not 2020 and we're not all avoiding in-person contact as much as possible. I also like that in this book, Irisanya mentions multiple times the fact that we strive to be an inclusive community, and we have made mistakes and continue to make mistakes, but we learn from them and are always seeking to do better, to be more inclusive, figure out ways that we can help more people feel comfortable. And so especially some of the groups that are specifically named in this book multiple times are the trans community, as well as there's a little chapter about reclaiming across the generations, which kind of deals with how do we deal with ageism, and how do we make sure that as some generations are wanting to maybe change, grow, update certain things, how are we making sure that we're doing that, but we're also taking into account what our elders still think is important? And because it is a consensus decision-based community, how do we find middle ground that makes everyone feel seen and heard, but also feels like it is properly representative of the global community that this has become? So Irisanya is not shy about mentioning that in this book at all, which I love. And so it talks about impact versus intention. There's a whole section on that. And like I said, there's the chapter about reclaiming across the generations and how we approach that, or how we are seeking to approach that. And inclusivity, not just in the sense of welcoming all races, all gender, all sexuality, all lived experiences, all classes, all backgrounds, all levels of experience, but also inclusivity in this being a political and activist-based tradition. How do we include those who don't yet feel like they are activists? And how do we make it so that everyone is able to participate? And along with that, how do we include parents and children? That's another aspect of the age thing. So all of that stuff is touched on in less than 100 pages here. I think Irisanya has done a really great job. One of the things that I do want to quote for you, I posted it on my Instagram shortly after I read it, at the end of chapter 4, which is the chapter about being your own spiritual authority in community and how to practice some of the basic stuff that is common to many reclaiming witches, how we practice. At the end of this chapter that has been about how there is no one typical reclaiming witch, we are all kinds of people, Irisanya writes, "Yes, this is what makes us reclaiming witches hard to define from the outside, to be sure. And this is why it's so important to experience a tradition of witchcraft from the inside at a ritual or a class before starting to define what it is." I love that because in my experience, and I have only been even tangentially involved with the reclaiming tradition for the past about 5 years now. And before that, I had already started reading some of the books and communicating with some other reclaiming witches. I don't feel that I started to get a sense of what it means to be part of this worldwide community as a tradition until I attended a camp and met a lot of other people. And then after that, because I met someone from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania community at that camp, I then started participating in things in Pittsburgh and also in Virginia with the community there, because those are the two communities that are geographically closest to me, being in Ohio, where they currently have active community doing ritual, having events, offering classes, skill shares, things like that. So although I had already started reading some of the introductory books, The Spiral Dance by Starhawk and The 12 Wild Swans, which was co-authored by Starhawk and Hilary Valentine, although I had already started doing the reading and some of the practicing at home stuff, I feel like I didn't get a really good idea of what was going on until I was able to experience some of it firsthand. And even if experience for me now, or for anyone, is partly just communicating with people who are part of this tradition online and sort of talking to them about their experiences, I think that's definitely been a way for me that I've been able to deepen my understanding of it. But I feel like I'm only able to do that because I've also worked with a lot of those people in person. I've circled with them, I've done magic with them face to face, in person, hand to hand, and so it's very difficult, especially in a year like 2020, to say well, you're not going to know what this tradition is about until you experience it. But at the same time, I feel like, the people that I know who are members of other specific traditions of witchcraft probably feel the same way, that there are a lot of things you can learn about by reading people's blog posts or reading books or practicing by yourself, but until you maybe go and participate in someone else's rites, someone else's rituals and communities, it's hard to really know from the outside. So something that has definitely been my experience is when I post about reclaiming tradition and people ask me questions about it based on things that they've read either in the Spiral Dance or on the website even, there are still things that people have questions about, and I try to explain things based on my experience, and people often hear what I'm saying and relate it to something in their mind that they already know from another tradition. And so a lot of people end up trying to make these direct connections, and it almost ends up making assumptions about oh, okay, so it's this. And then I find myself saying, well, no, not really, not exactly, but I can sort of see how you're trying to make that connection. They're like, oh, okay, so it's this. And it's no, it's not exactly that either. And so I really do find that it's incredibly difficult to explain to people what reclaiming is as a tradition if they have not experienced it in some way for themselves. And so I feel like this book is a really handy attempt at doing that. And Irisanya says right in the beginning, in the introduction or in the welcome somewhere, here it is, in the introduction, how do you talk about a place that feels like home? How do you express the magic and the love? How do you describe the ecstasy? The truth is, you can't. I can't bring you into a ritual with words. I can't tell you how your heart feels when you see people who have your back and who have held your hand as you cried away old stories. I can't tell you what it's like to be in meetings and camps and initiations. I can't tell you about sitting at a picnic table, listening to an elder laugh, and have you realize what a powerful moment it was. Here's what I can do. I can tell you what reclaiming is, how it is arranged, and what it strives to do. A little ways down, I can tell you that we're committed to dismantling structures of oppression, both of those outside and inside our bodies. I can tell you that we have our challenges and our worries. A little ways down, I can tell you that group dynamics are real and we're not always at our best, so on and so forth. So Irisanya says right here in the beginning, you cannot fully explain what this community is through the words of a book. And therefore, through reading it, we cannot fully understand either. But what this book can do is tell us a little bit about the structures behind it, the history behind it, what we strive to do, who we strive to be, the way that we commit to always trying to do better and learning from our mistakes so that we don't make them again. And I can say that as a person who has had some in-person experience with the tradition, I still learned new things from this book about more of the structure, more of the background aspects of the tradition that I have not yet had in-person contact with. You know, I haven't been on a council. I haven't been an organizer of an event or a camp. I haven't been a teacher, so I haven't been part of a teacher's guild. I haven't been part of making huge community-wide decisions. I have not been to a dandelion gathering where a lot of these community-wide issues are brought up. I have not been in person sitting in a process meeting. So there are a lot of things that come from the activism and anarchism areas of our background that I do not yet have experience with. I came to this tradition with a little bit of my own background in witchcraft, and a lot of the rest is new to me. So I learned new things from this, even having in-person contact with aspects of this tradition, taking classes in person, having been to a witch camp, and there's still a lot more. But I would say, if you are a person who has never had any contact with reclaiming before, the Spiral Dance and the 12 Wild Swans are really great introductory witchcraft books. The 12 Wild Swans, even more so, is formatted in the structure of a book version of what it would be like to go to a reclaiming witch camp. So by the time that book came out, reclaiming was a tradition. When the Spiral Dance came out, it wasn't yet. It was Starhawk in her 20s writing about witchcraft and the way that she had learned witchcraft and how some people were starting to practice together at that time and in that place in the 70s in California, with all of the activism and political and feminism and goddess spirituality influences. And so we read a lot of that in the Spiral Dance, and it is a foundational text for reclaiming as well as for other types of witches. There are other groups of witches who consider that a very important foundational text. But reclaiming was not the tradition that it is today when that book was written. So there are other things like this that really are going to tell you about the tradition, the community, the structure, the framework that we all work within. And so to me, it's not a one or the other, this book is better than that book. All of these books are sort of getting at very different things. They are teaching very different things. And so Spiral Dance can teach people a lot of basic witchcraft stuff and a little bit of the background of kind of where the beliefs started out. And then if you're reading the 20th anniversary edition, especially the notes will tell you some of the early updates in the first 2 decades of how conversations already started to change around concepts of gender identity and gender expression and gender roles, how we speak differently about gender and sexuality and energy and different terminology that we use, and how things already started to get a little more inclusive just in those first 2 decades. And now we're 2 more decades beyond that, and we have this. And this is a beautiful look at where we are right now and how we got here, and also a fair warning that we will continue to change and evolve and grow into the future. Another quote from the book that I loved is at the end of chapter 6, which is the chapter on core classes, where Irisanya writes that this chapter about classes is so long because the classes are really a core aspect of the tradition. And she writes, while there are books about reclaiming readily available and listed in the appendix, the experience of magic in community is ideal for finding out how reclaiming magic works with your magical needs. Being in community is part of the magic. Meeting people is part of the mystery. What you will uncover together is part of the joy. And I love that. And I have been having a lot of really great conversations with my friends within the reclaiming tradition as a result of this book. And again, like I said, it's very quick. I was talking to someone about it. I mentioned that I was reading it, and I said, it's really quick. It's less than 100 pages. And they said, oh, okay, cool. I'm going to go buy it for my Kindle. And they bought the ebook version right away, read through it in a couple of days, and we've been able to have conversations about it already because of that. And in the conclusion, a couple of my favorite quotes. The world shifts and changes no matter what we do, but it also shifts and changes because of what we do. And on the very last page of this text, it begins with this short paragraph. We have changed and we will change again. We are reclaiming ourselves as much as we are reclaiming power and magic. We are a tradition whose history began as a response to all those things around us, and we will continue to rise up to meet whatever comes next. So I think that pretty much sums up a lot of my favorite stuff about this book, and thank you, Irisanya. Thank you for being one of my teachers, and thank you for continuing to teach all of us. I follow you on Instagram, so I've been reading some of your thoughts there about, you know, these accomplishments and how much good they're doing and how much they're going to help other people, and you know, you're wondering what's going to come next. And you know, it's like that quote that I just read. That's what we're all doing. That's kind of the point, and you're one of the people who has personally taught me that. So thank you for writing this book, and thank you to Moon Books for publishing it. I do think it's fantastic, and I know that my friends within the tradition who I have talked to about it so far love it. And so if you're someone who's not connected to the tradition at all yet, but maybe you're interested in learning about it, I highly recommend this. Or if you're someone who has no interest in becoming connected to the tradition, but you just like to learn about other traditions and how other people do things, I definitely recommend this, because again, it's not just another how to do witchcraft book. It is really more about who are we as a community, how do we operate as a tradition. This has been a really long rambly video just to tell you, read this book, it's great. It probably will take you longer to watch and listen to this entire video than it will to read the book. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a quick read. You will probably enjoy it. The only bad thing I have to say about this is that there are typos in it. And so if that's the worst thing about it, you know, that's my opinion, obviously. I have a bias, but technically speaking, the only thing wrong with it is typos. And again, it's my first time reading a Pagan Portals book, so maybe that's just part of the editing process of Pagan Portals, because they're so quick. They're just a nice little, like, taste of something. Maybe they all have typos. If you can get past those, then you're good to go. While I'm giving shout outs to my teachers, I also want to thank Sheree for being my other Elements of Magic teacher, for being my friend from the internet for so many years, for basically being the entire catalyst to make me go to witch camp in the first place, because I knew that you would be there, so you would be one of my teachers. Thank you for co-teaching me with Irisanya. And yeah, I could now list all of the rest of the people who have been my teachers, because I love and appreciate all of them, but I won't do that. But basically, thank you, Sheree, for introducing me to Irisanya in a way. And thank you to all of our teachers. Thank you to all of our organizers. Thank you to all of our founders. I have been doing some Zoom sessions of magical activism with Starhawk this year. Thank you to all my friends in the Pittsburgh community, all of my online reclaiming friends, just everyone. And thank you to you for watching and or listening to this video. I will see you next time, and until then, so much love and magic to all of you. Don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.